The grand chamber of Vertex Prime felt different today, and Jake couldn't quite identify what had changed. But something in the air itself seemed charged with significance, as the human delegation stood in the center of the crystalline floor surrounded by representatives from 47 species who had gathered to witness the verdict that would determine humanity's place in the galaxy. High Arbiter Velnash floated above the assembly, and the hexagonal prism containing their essence rotated slowly, catching light from a billion distant stars that shone through the transparent dome overhead. And when the Arbiter spoke, their voice bypassed all translation devices and resonated directly in the minds of everyone present, with a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. The Council had deliberated long and carefully, the Arbiter said, and they had reviewed every aspect of humanity's performance across all 3 trials, and they had consulted ancient records and sought wisdom from the eldest members of their civilization, and they had debated the implications of what they had witnessed, because admitting a new species to the Council was not a decision to be made lightly. Humanity was young, the Arbiter continued, and by galactic standards humans had barely left their cradle world, and many species represented in this chamber had civilizations that existed before humans had discovered fire or invented writing, and it would be easy to dismiss humanity as too inexperienced and too reckless and too dangerous to grant full membership in an organization that prided itself on stability and order. A murmur rippled through the assembled delegates, and Jake felt his heart pounding so hard he was sure everyone in the chamber could hear it, and beside him Lisa stood rigid with tension, while Danny's hands were clasped behind his back with such force that his knuckles had gone white. However, the Arbiter said, and the chamber fell silent again because that single word carried the weight of everything that would follow, and the Arbiter explained that the trials existed not to judge what a species currently was, but rather to assess what they might become given time and opportunity, and in this regard humanity had shown something remarkable. Ambassador Thelkson of the Kryn Collective rose from his position, and his insectoid form towered over the other delegates as he requested permission to speak, and when the Arbiter granted it, Thelkson's compound eyes fixed on the humans, and he admitted that when they first arrived he had doubted them completely, because their technology seemed primitive, and their society appeared fractured, and their history was filled with conflicts that suggested they hadn't yet learned to live peacefully, even among themselves. He had expected them to fail the trials, the Ambassador continued, because so many others had failed before them, and nothing about humanity suggested they would be different, and yet they had not failed, and more importantly, they had not succeeded in the ways he had anticipated, because they approached every challenge with methods that defied conventional wisdom, and demonstrated capabilities that couldn't be measured by standard metrics. Elder Croven added his voice and spoke about the trial of knowledge, where humans had revealed a peculiar trait of refusing to accept impossible choices, and instead of selecting between bad options, they sought third alternatives that no one else had considered, and this wasn't naivety or ignorance, but rather a fundamental rejection of fatalism that marked them as a species who believed they could shape their own destiny, rather than simply reacting to circumstances beyond their control. Commander Zixal stood, and his forearms spread wide as he addressed the assembly, and spoke about the trial of strength, where humans had proven they understood that true power wasn't about domination, but about protection, and they had fought not for glory or conquest, but because others needed them, and they had placed themselves in danger repeatedly to ensure the safety of beings they had never met and owed nothing to. Kelthor drifted forward, and their tentacles rippled with emotion as they described being rescued from the research station and watching the human Marines fight through a nightmare scenario to save every single life inside, regardless of the cost, to themselves. And this observer, who had witnessed 23 species undergo the trials, said that none had demonstrated such a clear understanding that strength without compassion was just violence dressed up in formal uniforms. More voices joined in, and delegates who had initially opposed allowing humans to attempt the trials now spoke about the creativity and determination and empathy they had witnessed, and some shared stories from their own species' histories of young civilizations that had either grown into wisdom or collapsed under the weight of their own aggression, and the consensus seemed to be shifting in a direction Jake hardly dared to hope for. High Arbiter Velnash raised a crystalline appendage, and silence returned to the chamber as the ancient being prepared to deliver the final verdict. and the light within the prism intensified until it filled the entire space with radiance that made everyone present shield their eyes or adjust their visual sensors. The Council has spoken, the Arbiter announced, and the verdict is clear. Because humanity has not merely passed the trials, but has excelled in ways that reminded the Council why these trials existed in the first place, and humans had shown that even young species could possess wisdom, and that strength and compassion were not opposing forces but complementary virtues that reinforced each other. Jake felt Lisa grab his arm, and her grip was tight enough to hurt, but he barely noticed because his entire focus was on the Arbiter's next words, and the being said that humanity was hereby granted full membership in the Galactic Council with all rights and responsibilities that came with that status, and their voice would be heard in these halls, and their vote would carry weight in decisions that affected the entire galaxy. The chamber erupted in sound, and different species expressed approval in their own ways with whistles and clicks and harmonic resonances, and even some sounds that resembled human cheering. And Jake felt tears on his face and didn't care who saw them because this moment was bigger than pride or dignity. But Velnash wasn't finished, and the Arbiter explained that membership came with heavy responsibilities, and the Council would look to humanity to bring fresh perspectives to ancient problems, and their creativity would be needed, and their determination would be tested, and this was not merely an honor, but a burden that would require everything humanity had to give. Jake stepped forward, and his voice was steady when he said that humans understood the weight of what they were accepting, and they were ready to meet whatever challenges came, because humanity had always risen to meet impossible odds, especially when others depended on them, and they would not let the Council down. The Arbiter's light pulsed in what might have been approval, and said that the greatest test hadn't been the trials themselves, but rather what humans didn't know was being judged, because throughout their entire time among the Council, observers had watched how they treated beings they perceived as weaker or less important, and how they behaved when they thought no authority figures were watching. And in every instance, humanity had proven their values were genuine, rather than performance. "Welcome," the Arbiter said, and their voice carried across the chamber and beyond to every corner of Council space, where beings listened to this historic moment, and the Arbiter told humanity to walk among the stars not as legends or myths, but as living proof that the best qualities of civilization could be found in those brave enough to reach beyond themselves and strive for something greater than individual survival. The ceremony concluded with formal oaths and the recording of Earth's symbol among the official Council records, and Jake repeated words in a language older than human writing, pledging humanity's commitment to peace and cooperation and mutual defense. And as he spoke, he felt the weight of billions of people back home who would never know the details of what happened here, but whose future had just been irrevocably changed. Later, in a quiet observation deck where the human delegation gathered away from the crowds and celebrations, Jake stood looking at the stars spreading out in every direction, and Lisa came to stand beside him and said quietly that they had actually done it, and the disbelief in her voice matched what he felt. Danny laughed, and the sound was shaky with emotion, and he said that now they had to live up to the impossible standard they had set, and somehow that seemed even harder than passing the trials. And Amy added that at least they would face whatever came next with the entire Council behind them instead of having to prove themselves alone. Kyle spoke last, and his voice was thoughtful when he said his grandfather had always told him that legends were just stories about people who refused to accept limitations, and they had just proven the old man right, because they hadn't let anyone tell them humanity wasn't ready, and they had pushed through every obstacle until the galaxy itself acknowledged their worth. Paul, who had joined them after receiving clearance to leave his ship, reminded them that they weren't the end of humanity's story, but rather the beginning, because millions of humans would follow in their footsteps and explore and build and create relationships with species from across the galaxy, and the responsibility of setting a good example would fall on everyone, not just this small delegation. They stood together in silence for a while, looking out at their new home, because the galaxy belonged to humanity now. The final trial was different from anything the humans had faced before, and no amount of preparation could ready them for what waited in the nexus of reflection, because this place existed outside normal space, in a realm where physical laws bent to accommodate something older and stranger than matter itself. And here each person would face themselves in ways that stripped away pretense and exposed the raw truth of who they were, beneath the uniforms and ranks and roles they played. The Council representatives who escorted the human delegation to the Nexus entrance explained that no technology could help them inside, and no weapons would function, and they would each enter alone and face whatever the Nexus chose to show them. And the only way to pass the trial was to confront their deepest fears and acknowledge their greatest flaws, and emerge with their spirit intact and stronger for the experience. Jake was the first to step through the shimmering portal that marked the boundary between real space and the Nexus. And the transition was seamless and disorienting at the same time, like stepping from a bright room into darkness, except the darkness was filled with light that had no source and seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. The void around him was white and empty and featureless, and as he walked forward, the emptiness began to fill with images from his past, and he saw his childhood home in Colorado where he had grown up dreaming of stars, and he saw the academy where he had trained to become an officer, and he saw the bridge of his first command where he had made decisions that affected the lives of everyone under his authority. Then the memories darkened and twisted, and he found himself watching the worst moment of his career when he had ordered his crew to board a derelict vessel they had discovered during a deep space exploration mission, and against every protocol and safety regulation Jake had given into curiosity, and wanted to see what technology might be waiting inside that ancient ship. The boarding party had triggered a defense system that nobody knew was still active, and 3 crew members had died in the explosion that followed, and Jake had watched helplessly from his command chair as their life signs vanished from his displays, and he had known in that moment that their deaths were his fault, because he had put curiosity above caution and broken the rules that existed to prevent exactly this kind of tragedy. A figure appeared before him that looked exactly like Jake, except this version wore an expression of cold judgment, and spoke with his own voice, saying that he had killed those 3 people as surely as if he had pulled a trigger in their families, had lost sons and daughters and husbands and wives because one captain couldn't follow simple safety protocols, and now that same captain stood before the council, claiming he should lead humanity into an even larger arena where his mistakes could cost millions of lives instead of just 3. Jake felt the guilt rise up inside him like a living thing trying to choke off his breath, and part of him wanted to agree with this dark reflection and accept that he didn't deserve the responsibility he carried, because anyone who had made such a terrible mistake should never be trusted with important decisions again. But another part of him remembered the lessons he had learned from that tragedy, and how he had changed his approach to command, and how he had spent years studying every decision and questioning every assumption and trying to become the kind of leader who wouldn't make the same mistake twice. And he looked at his dark reflection and said that, yes, he had made a terrible mistake, and yes, 3 people had died because of his poor judgment. But he had learned from that failure and grown because of it. He told the reflection that he would make more mistakes in the future, because that was the nature of command, and anyone who claimed they would never fail was either lying or delusional. But the difference was that he would face those mistakes honestly and learn from them and try to do better next time. And that was all anyone could do, because perfection wasn't possible, but growth was. The dark reflection stared at him for a long moment and then slowly nodded and said that if Jake understood the weight of responsibility and the cost of failure, then perhaps he was worthy to carry that burden after all. And the void shifted, and Jake found himself standing on solid ground once more. Lisa entered the Nexus and found herself in a recreation of her family's farm in Iowa, where she had spent her childhood before leaving for the stars, and her parents sat on the porch looking older than she remembered, and their expressions held disappointment that cut deeper than any physical wound. Her mother spoke and said that Lisa had left them behind and chosen the emptiness of space over the warmth of family, and she had missed weddings and funerals and birthdays and all the important moments that made up a life because she was always somewhere else chasing dreams that took her further away from the people who loved her. Lisa felt tears on her face because this was the guilt she carried every day, and the choice she questioned constantly, whether dedicating her life to exploration and service meant abandoning the personal connections that made life meaningful, and she had no good answer because both things were true and she couldn't be in 2 places at once. She told her parents that she had chosen to serve something larger than herself, but that didn't mean she loved them any less, and every decision to leave had been painful, but necessary, because someone had to go out into the unknown and push humanity forward. And she had the skills and training to do that work, and so she had done it even though the personal cost was high. Her father said that all the service in the universe meant nothing if you lost yourself in the process and forgot where you came from, and Lisa nodded and said that she carried them with her everywhere she went, and their values and their love were part of everything she did, and she would never lose sight of that even when she was millions of light years from home. Her parents' expressions softened, and her mother said that as long as Lisa remembered where she came from and why service mattered, then she would never truly be lost among the stars. And the farm faded, and Lisa emerged from the Nexus with tears still wet on her cheeks, but clarity in her heart. Danny faced a nightmare of failing systems and cascading malfunctions where every repair he attempted made things worse, and he watched helplessly as the ship he was responsible for maintaining broke apart and killed everyone aboard. And a voice whispered that he was a fraud who pretended to be brilliant, but was really just one mistake away from catastrophic failure. He argued with the voice and said that every engineer lived with the fear of failure, because complex systems could fail in unpredictable ways. And all anyone could do was learn and improve and stay vigilant. And yes, he might make a fatal mistake someday. But he refused to let that fear paralyze him because fear without action was just surrender. Amy confronted her own capacity for violence and the part of her that enjoyed combat more than she wanted to admit. And she had to accept that aggression could be a tool used wisely rather than a flaw to be ashamed of. And Kyle faced his fear of inadequacy and learned that asking for help was strength rather than weakness because nobody could do everything alone. Helen dealt with the grief of patients she couldn't save and the guilt of being unable to heal everyone who needed her help, and she had to forgive herself for being human and having limits because accepting limitation was different from accepting defeat, and sometimes the best you could do was still not enough, and that didn't make you a failure. One by one, the members of the human delegation passed through the Nexus and emerged changed by what they had faced inside. And when they all stood together again in the chamber on Vertex Prime, they felt different somehow, as if part of them had been burned away in that strange place and what remained was stronger and clearer than before. High Arbiter. Vel Nash's crystalline prison pulsed with light, and the being's voice resonated in their minds, saying that they had completed all 3 trials and demonstrated knowledge and strength and spirit, and now the Council would deliberate on whether humanity deserved membership in the community of civilized species. The humans were escorted to waiting chambers where time seemed to stretch forever, as they sat in silence wondering if everything they had done was enough, or if the Council would find them lacking in some crucial way they hadn't anticipated. And Jake looked at his crew and saw the same mixture of hope and fear in their eyes because they had come so far and sacrificed so much. And now their fate rested in the hands of beings they barely understood. Tomorrow they would have their answer, and learn whether humanity would walk among the stars as equals or return home to wait another century before trying again, and the weight of that uncertainty pressed down on them like a physical force as they waited for judgment. The frontier regions of Council space were nothing like the civilized core where Vertex Prime floated in eternal twilight, and out here on the edges of known territory the law was more suggestion than rule, and pirates preyed on the weak while powerful species tested boundaries and pushed limits because they knew enforcement was slow to arrive, and often arrived too late to matter. And into this dangerous realm, the humans were sent to prove their strength. Commander Paul Harrison took control of the mission and brought with him additional crew members who specialized in combat operations and security protocols, and he stood on the bridge of the USS Endeavour and looked at the star charts showing Sector 4047, which would be their patrol area for the next 3 months, and the sector was a mess of asteroid fields and failing colony worlds and trade routes that passed through lawless space where anything could happen, and usually did. Lieutenant Sophie Grant sat at the pilot station, and her fingers moved across the controls with practiced ease as she plotted their initial patrol route, and beside her Chief Peter Wallace monitored the tactical displays, watching for any signs of trouble in the shipping lanes, and behind them, Dr. Helen Cross prepared the medical bay for whatever casualties might result from their time in this rough neighborhood where violence was common and mercy was rare. Their first week passed without incident, and they conducted routine patrols through dense asteroid fields and around colony worlds that barely registered on their sensors because the settlements were so small and primitive, and Paul used the time to drill his crew on combat procedures and emergency protocols because he knew from experience that when trouble came, it would come fast and hard, and there would be no time for hesitation or second-guessing. On the 8th day, everything changed when a distress call crackled through their communication system, and the voice on the other end was desperate and afraid, and speaking in the clicking language of the Mixari, who were peaceful traders known throughout the galaxy for their neutrality and their refusal to carry weapons even in dangerous space, and the message said they were under attack by raiders who had disabled their engines and were preparing to board. Sophie immediately calculated the distance and reported they were 20 minutes away at maximum burn, but sensors showed at least 4 raider vessels circling the disabled freighter like predators around wounded prey, and Paul didn't waste time with discussion or debate because he knew that 20 minutes might already be too late, but doing nothing definitely would be, and he ordered red alert and told Sophie to get them there as fast as the ship could fly. The Endeavour burst out of faster-than-light travel with weapons charged and shields raised, and the raider ship scattered like startled insects when they detected the human warship dropping into normal space right in the middle of their attack. And Paul opened a channel on all frequencies and identified himself, and warned the raiders that they were attacking a civilian vessel in Council-protected space, and they needed to stand down immediately or face the consequences of their actions. The raiders responded with weapons fire, and energy bolts splashed against the Endeavour's shields, lighting up the bridge displays with warnings about shield stress and power fluctuations, and Peter called out target solutions while Sophie threw the ship into evasive maneuvers that would have torn apart a vessel with less robust structural integrity, and the battle was on. Paul had fought in combat before during the brief but intense conflicts that had marked humanity's expansion into their local stellar neighborhood, and he knew that hesitation killed more soldiers than enemy fire ever did. And so he gave orders with calm precision and told Peter to target the lead raider's engines, and Sophie to bring them in close enough for accurate fire, but not so close that they couldn't maneuver if things went wrong. The human weapons spoke with voices of coherent light and superheated plasma, and the lead raider's engines exploded in a cascade of secondary detonations that left the ship tumbling dead through space, and the remaining 3 raiders tried to surround the Endeavour and hit it from multiple angles. But Sophie anticipated their movements and kept the human ship positioned so that only 1 or 2 raiders could fire at once, while Peter systematically disabled their weapons and propulsion systems. Within 10 minutes, 2 raider ships were drifting powerless, and the other 2 had fled into the asteroid field, where the Endeavour couldn't follow without risking collision with the massive chunks of rock that floated through the region like a cosmic minefield, and Paul ordered Sophie to bring them alongside the damaged freighter, and told Helen to prepare medical teams, because the Mixari crew would likely need assistance. The captain of the Mixari vessel was a being whose species looked like upright walking octopi, with skin that glowed in soft bioluminescent patterns that apparently conveyed emotion and meaning in ways the human translators struggled to fully capture. And this captain met the humans in the airlock and said simply that they had come, when others who heard previous distress calls had not, and their gratitude was beyond words. Helen and her medical team moved through the freighter treating injuries and stabilizing critical patients, while Danny and his engineers worked on temporary repairs to get the vessel's engines functioning well enough to limp to the nearest safe port, and Amy and Kyle secured the ship perimeter in case the raiders decided to return with reinforcements. Word of the rescue spread through Sector 447 faster than light could travel, because information moved through subspace communications networks that connected even the most remote outposts, and within 2 days the humans received 3 more distress calls from ships and stations under attack or facing emergencies, and each time Paul responded without hesitation, and each time his crew performed their duties with efficiency and courage that impressed even the most cynical observers. They defended a mining operation from claim jumpers who thought they could intimidate a small corporation into abandoning valuable asteroid deposits, and the humans arrived and simply placed their ship between the miners and the aggressors and dared anyone to start shooting. And the claim jumpers decided that whatever the asteroids contained wasn't worth fighting a human warship, and they left without firing a shot. They escorted a convoy of refugee ships through a dangerous passage where pirates operated with impunity, and the journey took 3 days of constant vigilance, and twice they had to fire warning shots to discourage attacks, but they delivered every refugee safely to their destination, and received thanks from species who had given up hope of ever reaching safety. They even mediated a territorial dispute between 2 rival factions who had been on the brink of war over mining rights in a mineral-rich system, and Paul spent 12 hours in negotiations that were tense and often hostile, but he refused to leave until both sides had agreed to a compromise that gave each faction what they needed while preserving peace in the region. But the true test came in the final week of their patrol when a research station studying a nearby nebula suddenly went dark, and all communication ceased, and when the Endeavour arrived to investigate, they found the station intact. But something had gone wrong inside, and life signs were scattered throughout the facility, in patterns that suggested the survivors were hiding or trapped. Scans revealed the problem, and it was worse than anyone had expected because void crawlers had somehow breached containment, and these parasitic creatures were nightmares made flesh with chitinous armor that resisted most weapons and claws that could tear through hull plating, and a feeding behavior that involved implanting eggs in living hosts, and the station was infested with them. Peter reported approximately 50 life signs still active inside the station, but couldn't determine how many were researchers and how many might be council observers who had been monitoring the human performance. And Paul knew that leaving anyone behind wasn't an option, regardless of who they were or what their role had been. Amy and Kyle led the Marine boarding party, and they moved through the darkened corridors with weapons ready and senses alert for any sign of movement. And the void crawlers were fast and vicious, and they attacked from shadows and ventilation shafts, and anywhere else that offered concealment, and the Marines fought with controlled aggression that came from extensive training in hostile environment combat. The rescue operation took hours, and every minute felt like an eternity as the Marines pushed deeper into the station, room by room and corridor by corridor, and they found survivors huddled in laboratories and barricaded in storage rooms and hiding in maintenance tunnels, and each time the humans formed protective walls with their own bodies and ensured the rescued made it safely back to extraction points, where Sophie waited with a shuttle. Kyle took a hit from a crawler's tail barb, and the toxin burned through his armor and into his shoulder, and the pain was incredible, but he kept moving and kept fighting because there were still people inside who needed rescue, and falling back meant leaving them to die, and that wasn't something he could accept. When the last researcher was finally aboard the Endeavour and the station had been purged with controlled explosions that would prevent the void crawlers from spreading to other locations, Paul allowed himself a moment of exhaustion, and he sat in his command chair and realized his hands were shaking from the adrenaline that was finally wearing off. The archive worlds appeared on their view screen as twin planets locked in a gravitational dance around each other, and both worlds had been completely transformed into libraries that housed the collected knowledge of every species that had ever joined the council, and the sight of them took Jake's breath away because he had never imagined that this much information could exist in one place. And both planets glowed with soft blue light from the millions of crystalline structures that covered their surfaces like geometric forests growing out of artificial soil. The human delegation landed at the designated coordinates on the larger of the two worlds, and they were met by a reception committee of scholars who belonged to species Jake had never seen before, and each one carried themselves with an air of quiet authority that came from spending lifetimes studying the accumulated wisdom of civilizations that spanned the galaxy. And the lead scholar introduced himself as Elder Croven of the Saurian Confederacy, and his reptilian features reminded Jake of the dinosaurs from Earth's ancient past, except this creature wore robes of shimmering fabric and spoke with a voice that carried the weight of 4,000 years of experience. Croven explained that the trial of knowledge would test their understanding across multiple domains, including science and philosophy and ethics and culture, and each member of the human delegation would face different questions tailored to their role and expertise, and the goal wasn't to see if they knew everything, because no species could claim that, but rather to understand how they thought and how they approached problems, and whether their minds were flexible enough to grasp concepts that might be completely alien to their previous experience. Lisa was escorted to a chamber that seemed to be carved from a single massive crystal, and inside she found herself alone with Croven, who gestured for her to sit on a bench that adjusted itself to her human proportions, and the elder settled onto a platform across from her, and his tongue flicked out to taste the air before he began asking questions that started simple enough, with basic physics and mathematics that any academy graduate could answer, but quickly evolved into something far more complex and challenging. The reptilian scholar posed a moral scenario that made Lisa uncomfortable from the moment she heard it, and he described a situation where two cities existed and one held 1 million people, while the other held only 10,000, and a disaster was coming that would destroy one of these cities, and she had the power to choose which one would be saved. And he asked her how she would make that decision, and what principles would guide her choice. Lisa didn't hesitate before answering because she had learned long ago that hesitation in the face of impossible questions suggested you were looking for the answer someone wanted to hear, rather than the truth you believed. and she told Croven that she would spend every second she had available trying to find a third option because humans didn't accept impossible choices when there might be a way to save everyone, and she would exhaust every possibility before accepting that anyone had to die. Croven pressed the question and asked what she would do if there truly was no third option, and time was running out and she had to choose. And Lisa felt her throat tighten, but she answered honestly that she would save the million, because that was the mathematical answer that preserved the most lives. But she also said she would never forgive herself for that choice, and she would dedicate the rest of her life to making sure such a scenario could never happen again, because the guilt of sacrificing 10,000 people would haunt her forever, and that was the price she would have to pay for making the logical choice. Meanwhile, in another part of the archive, Danny stood in a workshop surrounded by alien technology that looked nothing like anything he had ever worked with before, and a group of observers watched him silently as he was given his challenge, which was to repair a damaged quantum resonator using only the tools and materials from the human ship. And this device was critical for maintaining stable wormholes, and its design followed principles that human engineering had never encountered. Danny walked around the device 3 times, studying it from every angle and running his hands carefully over its surface, feeling for heat signatures and vibration patterns, and listening to the subtle sounds it made when he activated different components. And the observers said nothing, but he could feel their eyes on him, watching his every move and judging whether this human possessed the technical knowledge and intuitive understanding that separated competent engineers from true masters of their craft. For 6 hours, Danny worked without stopping, and sweat dripped from his forehead onto the workbench as he traced circuits that seemed to defy logic and tested power flows that shouldn't have been possible according to human physics. And he muttered calculations under his breath while his hands moved with practiced precision through the alien components, and several times he stopped and stared at the device as if willing it to reveal its secrets through sheer force of concentration. Finally, he stepped back and wiped his hands on his uniform and told the observers to try the device now, and when they activated it, the quantum resonator hummed to life and its output readings stabilized at optimal levels, and one of the observers, who appeared to be made of living crystal, tilted their body in what might have been curiosity, and stated that Danny had not followed the standard repair protocols that were documented in the archive. Danny admitted this was true and explained that the standard protocols would have worked eventually, but they required 3 times as long to complete and needed materials that humans didn't have access to, and so he had improvised a solution using what was available and applying principles from human engineering that seemed compatible with the alien technology. And the crystalline being asked if improvisation was wise when dealing with critical systems, and Danny smiled and said that maybe it wasn't always wise, but sometimes it was necessary. And besides, the device was working now, which proved his approach had merit. Captain Jake Morrison faced a different kind of test entirely, and he was brought before a council of military strategists representing some of the most warlike species in the galaxy, and they showed him recordings of historical battles that had been fought across thousands of years and millions of light years, and his task was to analyze these conflicts and identify what each side had done right and done wrong, and what he would have done differently if he had been in command. One particular scenario caught the attention of his examiners, and it showed a defensive war where a technologically inferior species had managed to hold off an invasion force 10 times their size for 3 full years before finally surrendering. And Commander Zixel of the Valtorian Empire, who possessed 4 arms and armor that looked like it had been forged from volcanic rock, asked Jake what he saw as the defenders' greatest failure. Jake studied the tactical data carefully and reviewed the casualty reports and resource expenditures in the timeline of major engagements, and when he finally spoke, he said that he didn't see a failure at all because holding out for 3 years against impossible odds wasn't a defeat, but rather a testament to courage and ingenuity and strategic brilliance, and the fact that they eventually surrendered didn't diminish what they had accomplished. Zixel challenged this assessment and pointed out that surrender was surrender, regardless of how long it took, and the species in question had lost the war, which by definition meant they had failed in their objective, and Jake shook his head and replied that survival was the ultimate objective when you were facing extinction, and by surrendering, when they did, this species had preserved their people and their culture and their future, and he would bet that they were still around today and probably thriving. The Valtorian commander's mandibles twitched, and what Jake had learned was their version of a smile, and Zixel confirmed that the species in question had indeed survived, and they had joined the Council 800 years after their surrender, and they now served as the primary diplomatic corps because they understood better than most that knowing when to fight and when to negotiate wasn't weakness, but wisdom. The trials continued for weeks, and each member of the human delegation was pushed to their limits in different ways, and Amy was tested on her understanding of tactical ethics and when it was acceptable to use force, and Kyle faced questions about leadership under pressure and how to maintain unit cohesion when everything was falling apart. And each time the humans surprised their examiners by approaching problems from angles that hadn't been considered and offering solutions that combined logic with empathy in ways that seemed uniquely human. On the final day of the Trial of Knowledge, all the delegates gathered in the Grand Hall of the Archives, and High Scholar Venthara addressed them. And this being was ancient beyond measure, and belonged to a species that aged backwards, and therefore possessed memories of events that hadn't happened yet, which gave them a perspective on time that other species found deeply unsettling. Venthara spoke with gravity, and said that the humans had answered questions and solved puzzles, and demonstrated capability across multiple domains, but knowledge alone was not sufficient for wisdom, and the Council would deliberate on their performance before announcing whether they had passed this first trial, and the scholar reminded them that 2 more trials remained, and the Galactic Council had existed for 12,000 years, and nobody questioned its authority anymore because every species that mattered belonged to it, and those who didn't belong simply didn't matter in the grand scheme of things across the stars and throughout the known universe where civilizations rose and fell like waves on an endless cosmic ocean. But the Council remained constant and unchanging, like a lighthouse in the darkness of space guiding all who sought order and peace, and cooperation among the countless worlds that spun through the void. The chamber where the Council met was massive beyond human comprehension, and it floated inside a space station called Vertex Prime that orbited the galactic core where stars clustered so thick that night never truly fell, and the sky burned with perpetual twilight made of a billion distant suns. And here in this place, representatives from 47 different species gathered to make decisions that affected trillions of lives across thousands of worlds. And today, they were all staring at something none of them had expected to see. Captain Jake Morrison stood in the center of the crystalline floor, and his boots made small echoing sounds that seemed too loud in the sudden silence that had fallen over the assembly when he and his crew had walked through the massive doors and into the presence of the galaxy's rulers. And beside him stood Lieutenant Lisa Hayes, who had navigated their ship through dangers that would have destroyed lesser pilots, and Chief Engineer Danny Brooks, whose clever hands had kept their vessel running when every system should have failed. And behind them stood 2 Marines named Corporal Amy Price and Sergeant Kyle Turner, who kept their faces neutral and their hands near their weapons, even though they knew that if things went wrong here, no amount of firepower would save them. The humans had arrived without warning and without permission, and they stood now before the Council not as beggars asking for mercy, and not as conquerors demanding recognition, but as equals who believed they deserved a seat at the table where the future of the galaxy was decided. And this attitude alone was enough to cause confusion and concern among beings who had followed the same protocols and traditions for longer than human civilization had existed. Ambassador Thelkson of the Kryn Collective rose from his position, and his insectoid body towered over most of the other delegates, and his compound eyes glittered like cut diamonds as he looked down at the humans, and his mandibles clicked together in a pattern that the translation devices worn by everyone in the chamber converted into standard galactic speech. And he said that according to Council records, the human homeworld had only achieved faster than light travel 3 years ago by galactic standard time, and most species required centuries to stabilize such dangerous technology. And yet here the humans stood claiming they were ready to join the most advanced civilizations in the known universe. Jake kept his face calm and his voice steady when he replied that humans were quick learners and they didn't see any point in waiting centuries when they could prove themselves ready right now. And this statement caused what might have been laughter from some delegates while others remained silent and calculating, because the appearance of a new species was always a moment of uncertainty and opportunity and danger, all mixed together in ways that could reshape the balance of power that the Council had maintained for so long. High Arbiter Velnash spoke next. And this being was unlike any of the others because it had no physical form in the traditional sense, but existed as pure energy contained within a hexagonal prism of crystal that floated above the assembly, and, when it spoke, its voice bypassed the need for translation devices and instead resonated directly inside the minds of everyone present. And it said that the council had protocols that had been tested and refined over thousands of years, and any species seeking membership had to demonstrate three things, which were technological achievement and cultural stability and peaceful intent. And while the human presence here suggested they had achieved the first requirement, the council knew nothing about their history or their values or their capacity to coexist with species very different from themselves. Lisa stepped forward then, and her voice was clear and confident when she said that humans were willing to prove themselves through whatever trials or tests the council deemed appropriate, because they hadn't crossed the vast empty darkness between stars just to turn back at the first sign of difficulty. And this statement seemed to impress some of the delegates, while others looked skeptical because words were easy, but actions required commitment and sacrifice, and many species had spoken bravely before the council, only to fail when faced with the reality of what membership truly demanded. The Arbiter's crystalline prison pulsed with light that shifted through colors humans had no names for, and after a long moment of consideration, it announced that humanity would be permitted to undergo the trials of merit, which were a series of challenges designed to test every aspect of a species' worthiness to join the council, and the humans would have 6 galactic standard months to complete these trials, and success would grant them a seat at the table of civilization, while failure would mean isolation and possibly permanent exclusion from the community of advanced species, because the council could not risk admitting members who might destabilize the careful balance that kept war and chaos at bay. The session concluded with formal declarations and procedural statements that Jake barely heard, because his mind was already racing ahead to what the trials might involve and what his crew would need to do to succeed. And as they left the chamber, they passed beneath an ancient archway that had been carved from a single piece of stone, older than human writing, and the stone was covered in text, written in hundreds of different languages and scripts, and though Jake couldn't read most of them, he recognized the meaning because it was universal across all the translations, and it said that only the worthy may shape the future. Outside the chamber, the human delegation gathered in a small anteroom, where they could speak privately, and Danny was the first to break the silence, when he said that they had just committed humanity to a test they knew nothing about. And Amy pointed out that this was pretty much how humans did everything, and they figured things out as they went along. And Kyle added that at least they had 6 months, which was more time than they usually got to prepare for the impossible. Jake looked at his crew and saw the mixture of excitement and fear and determination in their eyes, and he knew they were all thinking the same thing, which was that they had just taken a step that would change humanity forever, and there was no going back now, because word of their arrival would already be spreading across the galaxy, and every species would be watching to see if humans were worthy, or just another young race that had reached too far too fast and burned themselves out, like so many others throughout history. Lisa pulled up a datapad and began reviewing what little information they had about the trials of merit, and what she found wasn't encouraging, because the records showed that out of the last 50 species to attempt the trials, only 7 had succeeded, and the others had either failed outright or had been so damaged by the attempt that they had withdrawn from galactic affairs entirely and retreated to their home systems to lick their wounds and rebuild their shattered pride. But Jake wasn't thinking about failure, because failure wasn't an option when you were representing your entire species, and he told his crew that they would take this one step at a time, and they would face each challenge as it came, and they would succeed, because that's what humans did when the odds were against them and when everyone expected them to fail, and when the only alternative was to give up and go home and admit they weren't ready for the galaxy. The next morning they received their first instructions, and the message was simple and direct, and it told them to report to the archive worlds where they would face the trial of knowledge. And Jake looked at his crew and said it was time to show the galaxy what humans were made of, and they left Vertex Prime behind and set course for whatever waited ahead, knowing that the easy part was over and the real test was about to begin.